5th of January, 1945. Bastogne Clearing Station. The air inside the advanced triage tent snapped with the competing smells of wet canvas, sharp antiseptic, and gangrene. Outside, the artillery rumbled, a dull percussion against the thin fabric walls. But inside, the only steady sound was the hum of a single generator. Helga drew the coarse wool blanket higher onto the young American soldier's chest. He shivered violently, his eyes wide and unfocused with fever. "You are safe now, Junge," she whispered, her fingers checking the thready pulse at his neck. She recognized the creeping flush of sepsis. Above the operating theater entrance, a crude, hand-painted sign read, "Triage priority, severity only, rank, nationality, second." It was a ritual now, reading it, believing it. The American major looked up from the next cot, his face gray with exhaustion. "Nurse," he called, his voice rough. "Check the penicillin stock. We need it for that GI." Helga paused, her hand instinctively going to the small, cold glass vial in her pocket. It still felt heavier than gold. The history of medicine is full of these quiet, profound moments. We invite you to subscribe and share your thoughts on healing across front lines. 8 weeks earlier, France. The mud was the first betrayal. It was November 1944, and the world Helga had known was dissolving not in fire, but in a cold, gray rain that turned the fields of France into a sucking morass. The retreat had been chaotic. Her field dressing station, once a proud, orderly unit of the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, had been overrun in less than 10 minutes. Now, she stood in a processing line, shivering. The propaganda broadcasts had been clear. The Americans were gangsters, barbarians who took no prisoners. She watched them, the oversized, well-fed soldiers chewing gum, their movements casual, almost bored. This nonchalance was terrifying. "You!" A voice cut through the rain. Helga flinched. An American officer, a captain, was pointing not at her, but at the sullied red cross on her armband. He looked impossibly tired and spoke to a guard. "Medical. She's medical. Get her out of the line and to the 801st. We're drowning." Helga understood only medical. She was separated from the other prisoners, her heart pounding. This was it. The interrogation. The special punishment reserved for those who served the Reich. She was pushed onto the canvas seat of a jeep. The driver did not speak to her. They drove for 20 minutes, deeper behind the Allied lines, the rumble of the front fading, replaced by the mechanical grind of a massive, sprawling logistics train. They arrived not at a prison, but at a city of tents. A sign, hammered into the mud, read, 801st Evacuation Hospital. The jeep stopped, and the driver jerked his thumb. Out. Helga stepped down, bracing herself. She expected filth, chaos, the smell of death she knew so well. The smell hit her, but it was wrong. Beneath the odors of blood and mud and damp canvas, there was an overpowering, sharp scent. Antiseptic. A large tent flap was thrown open, spilling yellow light. A woman in American nursing fatigues, her face etched with exhaustion, emerged. She looked at Helga, at her uniform, and merely sighed. "God, another one. Can you work?" Helga stared. "Can you work?" the nurse repeated, slower. Helga nodded stiffly. Nurse. "I don't care if you're the Kaiser's personal physician," the woman snapped, grabbing Helga's arm and pulling her inside. "Wash." She pointed to a basin. Beside it was a stack of clean towels and 3 bars of lye soap. Helga looked from the soap to the tent's interior. It was organized. It was brightly lit by generators. Cots were in neat rows, and the supplies. Against one wall, wooden shelves reached the canvas ceiling, stacked high with boxes of sterile gauze, sutures, and rows upon rows of small glass vials. Her propaganda-fueled image of brutish degenerates crumbled. Barbarians did not maintain supply lines like this. This was industrial. This was wealth. She washed her hands, the harsh soap stinging the cuts on her fingers. This had to be a facade. She she thought desperately. A show for the International Red Cross inspectors. Move it, the American nurse said, shoving a pile of white bandages into her arms. Post-op. Bays 3 and 4. They bleed, you yell. They stop breathing. You yell louder. Helga walked, woodenly, into the main ward. The nurse stopped her one last time. And nurse? They're just patients. Got it? Helga looked down the long row. She saw the pale, suffering faces of American boys, and interspersed between them, the gray, familiar uniforms of her own countrymen. Work was a refuge. Her hands knew the rhythms of folding gauze, checking a pulse, and swabbing skin. Even when her mind was reeling, Helga moved through the humid, canvas-scented air of the ward, a ghost in her own gray DRK uniform among the American olive drab. She kept her head down and watched for the cruelty. She knew it was hiding, waiting. At 2,200 hours, an orderly pushed a rattling cart down the aisle. He was ladling a thick stew into tin bowls. Helga watched as he approached the end of the row, where cot 10 held an American with a chest wound, and cot 11 held a German Fallschirmjäger with a shattered leg. The orderly gave the first bowl to the American. He then ladled the exact same portion for the German. Helga stopped. She stared at the steam rising from the German's bowl. It was the same. Not watery broth, not scraps. The same stew. The German soldier looked at the bowl, then at the orderly, his eyes wide with disbelief, before he began to eat like a starved animal. Helga forced herself to turn away. It was a performance. It had to be. Perhaps they were expecting an inspection from the International Red Cross. That was the only logical explanation. An hour later, the Fallschirmjäger in cot 11 began to moan, his body arching in a spasm of pain. Before Helga could react, the American head nurse, Major Stark, they called her, was at his bedside. She checked his chart, a simple clipboard, and called to another nurse. He's due. Give him a quarter grain of morphine. Helga's blood ran cold. Morphine. In her unit, morphine was guarded by the chief surgeon himself. It was triaged as severely as the patients. It was never given to an enemy unless he was an officer for interrogation. This was a simple paratrooper. They were wasting it on him. She moved to the supply station to fetch sterile water, her hands unsteady. She looked again at the shelves. The rows of small glass vials. Hundreds of them. Not just saline. She could see labels now. Morphine sulfate. Sulfadiazine. They had so much they could afford to be kind. This was not humanity. It was arrogance. It was the crushing, indifferent power of a nation that could blot out the sun with its factories. She was changing the dressing on a German corporal's arm when a voice from the next cot snapped at her. What are you patching up a kraut for? Helga flinched. She looked over. A young American GI, his face pale and sweating with fever, was glaring at her. Oughta let I am bleed out. Wasting good bandages. This was it. The hate. The true face of the Amerikaner. She froze, bracing for the guard, the officer, to join in. A young MP, who had been standing near the tent flap, walked over. He did not look at Helga. He looked at the GI. Quiet, soldier, the MP said, his voice low and heavy with exhaustion. But she's a... The GI sputtered. She's a nurse, the MP cut him off. And you're a patient. Close your eyes and be one. The MP tapped his helmet, a gesture of finality, and walked away. The GI stared at the canvas ceiling, sullen and silent. Helga finished tying the bandage. Her fingers trembled. The MP had defended her. He had defended her profession against his own soldier. She was the enemy, yet her gray uniform with its red cross had, in that moment, mattered more than the uniform of the man in the bed. She did not understand. This broke every rule of warfare she had been taught. As she disposed of the soiled dressings, the main tent flaps were thrown open again, bringing a gust of frigid air and a new sound. It was not a moan. It was a sharp, frantic scream from a medic. Triage. We got inbound, Major. Triage team, now. The tent flaps flew open, and the cold November rain seemed to follow the stretchers in. The floor, Moments before a space of relative quiet became a frantic choreography of mud, blood, and shouted commands. "Set him down, anywhere, get the stretchers out." Major Stark, the head nurse, grabbed Helga by the arm. "You, with me. Surgical tent." Helga did not resist. She was pulled through the canvas corridor that connected the ward to the operating theater, a tent defined by a brighter, harsher glare and the overwhelming smell of antiseptic vapor. In the center of this chaos stood a man she had only seen in glimpses. He was tall, thin, and wiping his hands on a towel that was already stained. This was Major Davies, the chief surgeon. He did not look up, his eyes already scanning the first stretcher. "All right, what do we have?" His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, like a machine. This was the ritual Helga had dreaded. Triage. In the German system, it was triage too. But there was always a secondary triage. Us. And them. Abdominal, GSW, American, a medic reported. Davies leaned over, pressed his hands lightly on the man's stomach, and looked at his eyes. "Red tag. Get him on table 1. Next." The second stretcher was brought in. A German. His face was a mask of waxy, pale skin, his breathing shallow. Helga tensed. She watched Davies's face, searching for the flicker of contempt. The pause that would signal this man's life was worthless. Davies did not even glance at the man's uniform. His eyes went to the bloody mass where the soldier's left leg had been. A crude tourniquet was high on the thigh. "Tag him yellow," Davies said. "He's stable for now. Get him to post-op and start plasma." He moved to the third stretcher. An American, his uniform blackened and smoking slightly. The smell of burned flesh and hair cut through the antiseptic. Davies spent less than 3 seconds. "Tag him black." "Sir?" the medic asked, his voice cracking. "He's gone," Davies said, not unkindly, but with absolute finality. "His airway is seared. Nothing we can do. Give him morphine." Next. Helga felt her stomach clench. The surgeon had just condemned one of his own men with the same breath he used to order coffee. The fourth stretcher was a German. He was conscious, clutching his stomach, his intestines visibly looped through a gaping wound. It was a mortal injury. Helga knew it. This man would be tagged black and left to die. She braced herself. Davies kneeled. He looked at the wound, then at the soldier's face. The German was whispering. "Mutter. Bit." Davies ignored the plea. He pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, feeling his pulse. He looked at his color. "He's strong. BP is holding for now." He grabbed a red tag from the kit and wired it to the German stretcher. "Red tag. He's next on table 2. Nurse." He pointed at Helga. "You. Hold pressure on that wound. Do not let go until he is on the table. Do you understand me?" Helga stared, dumbfounded. "Nurse," Davies barked. "Do you understand?" Yes, sir." She dropped to her knees beside the German soldier, pressing her hands onto the makeshift bandage, her mind blank with shock. The surgeon had tagged an American black and a German red. He had prioritized the enemy. No, he hadn't. She looked at Davies, who was already at the next stretcher. His movements quick, economical, and utterly impersonal. He wasn't seeing Americans or Germans. He wasn't seeing men. He was seeing injuries. A ruptured spleen, a collapsed lung, a femoral artery bleed. He was a mechanic. Triage his diagnostic ritual, and this tent, his garage. Her fear, the sharp-edged terror of the last 48 hours, suddenly evaporated, replaced by something else. The cold, familiar focus of her profession. "He's bleeding through, sir," Helga called out, her voice clear. "Add more pressure," Davies replied, not looking up. "You're 2 minutes out." The triage rush subsided as dawn approached, leaving behind the gray, exhausted calm that follows a crisis. The surgical teams were still working, but the flow of new stretchers had stopped. Helga was sent back to the post-op ward, her muscles aching, her mind strangely quiet. The cold focus she'd found in the operating tent remained. She was a nurse. These were patients. That was all. She moved down the rows, checking bandages and drainage tubes. The ward was quieter now, the silence broken only by groans and the rustle of wool blankets. She stopped at cot 11, where the Fallschirmjäger who had received the stew and morphine was sleeping, his breathing regular. She then moved to cot 14. This was another German, a young corporal named Hans, according to the tag on his stretcher. He had come in with a severe shrapnel wound to his thigh. Davies had tagged him yellow, deeming him stable. But he was not stable. Helga saw it instantly. His face, visible in the weak morning light, was flushed a deep, mottled red. His breathing was too fast, too shallow. She touched his forehead, recoiling slightly. He was burning. "No," she whispered, pulling back the blanket. The smell hit her first, that sickly, sweet-sour odor of putrefaction she knew better than her own name. It was the smell of gangrene. The dressing, which had been clean hours before, was now soaked with a foul, brownish-yellow discharge. The tissue around the wound was swollen and had a dark, purplish tint. Hans's eyes fluttered open, but they were vacant, milky with fever. He began to mutter, a low, constant stream of German. "Kalt." Mutter. "Es ist so kalt." He was dying of sepsis. Helga felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. She knew this timeline. She had seen it 100 times on the Eastern Front. He had 12 hours, perhaps 16. In her hospital, they would have attempted a desperate, high-thigh amputation, which he would not have survived. Or they would have simply moved him to the dying tent to make space. This was the true test. The Americans could afford to be fair in triage. It cost them nothing but time. They could afford to hand out stew and the occasional quarter grain of morphine. But this was different. This required a miracle. And Helga knew the Americans possessed that miracle. She had seen the small glass vials on the supply shelf, though she had not dared to read their labels. In Germany, it was a word spoken with the same reverence as Wunderwaffe. It was a myth, a golden elixir reserved for Hitler's inner circle, for generals and gall-eaters. It was not for simple soldiers. It was certainly not for the enemy. She stood there, paralyzed by a new, more complex cynicism. They would let him die. Their humanity had a limit, and that limit was the edge of an expensive ampule. She heard footsteps and turned. Major Davies was walking the ward, his surgical gown replaced with a stained shirt. His face was a gray mask of sleeplessness. He stopped, looking at her, then at the patient. "What is it, nurse?" Helga's voice was hard, brittle. She did not know she was doing it. But she was issuing a challenge. "He's septic, sir." Davies bent down, looked at the leg for a long moment, and sniffed the air. He showed no reaction. He simply straightened up. "I know. I've been watching him. His temperature is 104. Helga stared at him. "He is German," she said, the words falling from her lips before she could stop them. "He has severe sepsis." She was accusing him. She was saying, "This is where you stop. This is where your pretense of mercy ends." Davies met her gaze. His eyes were not angry, just profoundly tired. He seemed to look right through her, to see the years of propaganda and hatred she was clutching like a shield. "I am aware of his nationality, nurse," he said softly, "and his diagnosis." He turned to Major Stark, who was approaching with a clipboard. "Major, get me a 50,000 unit dose of penicillin." Helga's mind refused to process the order. Penicillin. The word hung in the air, an impossibility. She felt a bizarre, hysterical laugh bubble in her throat. She must have misheard. The exhaustion, the stress she had misunderstood his English. He must have been ordering saline, or perhaps plasma, or, she thought, desperately trying to re-anchor her reality. The order was for someone else. She glanced at the next cot, where the American GI with the high fever was sleeping restlessly. Of course. The penicillin was for him. Davies had simply been looking at the German's cot when he said it. It was a simple mistake of timing, but Major Stark had not misunderstood. She gave a single, professional nod. "Yes, doctor. 50,000 units." She turned, not toward the American GI, but toward the supply shelves. Helga watched, her body rigid, Her breath held tight in her chest. She was detached, watching a play. This was not real. Stark moved with the unhurried efficiency of a woman retrieving aspirin. Her hand went directly to the third shelf, the shelf Helga had noted earlier, the one with the rows of small glass vials. Stark's fingers selected one. It was exactly as Helga had imagined. A small, amber-colored vial, no bigger than her thumb, sealed with a rubber stopper. It looked so insignificant. It looked like everything. Major Stark returned to cot 14. Hans's cot. No, Helga whispered. The sound was inaudible, lost in the hum of the generator. Stark ignored Helga, her focus entirely on the task. She wiped the rubber stopper with an alcohol swab, punctured it with a sterile needle, and drew the pale golden liquid into a glass syringe. Helga's world tilted. Back in Cologne, she had watched a Luftwaffe colonel, a hero of the Reich, die of an infection that would have been cured by this exact liquid. She had heard whispers that only the General Feldmarschalls could access it. It was a substance of pure myth, a divine right reserved for the architects of the new Germany. And here, in a mud-floored tent in France, a middle-aged American woman was preparing to squander it on an unconscious, anonymous enemy corporal. It was an insult. It was madness. It was the most profound act of waste Helga had ever witnessed. It was like using a bar of gold to prop up a broken table leg. Major Stark tapped the syringe, expelling a tiny bead of the precious fluid onto the needle's tip. She expertly swabbed the German soldier's arm and, without hesitation, slid the needle into his vein. Helga stopped breathing. Stark slowly, methodically, depressed the plunger. The drug was in. The act was complete. Davies, the surgeon, had not even waited to watch. He was already at the far end of the ward, examining a patient's drainage tube. To him, the event was so routine, so utterly mundane, it did not even warrant his attention. Stark withdrew the needle, disposed of the empty glass vial in a metal bin, and made a notation on Hans's chart. She then looked up, her gaze finally falling on Helga. Helga was swaying, her face the color of ash. Major Stark's professional mask softened just a fraction. "Nurse?" she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You're done. Go to the mess tent. Get coffee. That's an order." Helga wanted to obey, but her boots felt nailed to the mud-soaked floorboards. She could only stare at the small, red puncture mark on the German soldier's arm. Major Stark's order to get coffee did not register. Helga could not feel her feet. She remained fixed, a statue of gray wool, listening to the drip of saline into a bottle and the distant, rhythmic cough of a generator. The empty glass vial was gone, already mixed with the other medical waste, but she could still see it. A small, amber ghost. It represented a fundamental break in the laws of nature. It was as if she had watched a man lift a tank with his bare hands. It was an act of casual, impossible power. Her entire system of belief, meticulously constructed over a decade by state radio, by posters, by the hushed, fearful whispers of her neighbors, was a ruin. The Americans were not the brutes. They were not the savages. Or perhaps, a darker thought surfaced, they were. Perhaps this was the true savagery, a cruelty so profound, so arrogant, that they could save their enemies simply to prove that they could, to demonstrate that a single German life, a life she had been taught was precious and superior, was worth less to them than a single dose of medicine they had in limitless supply. She needed an answer. She could not breathe until she had one. She turned. Her legs, stiff and robotic, began to move. She walked past cot 14, where the German corporal now lay in a deep, medicated sleep. She walked past Major Stark, who watched her with a look of resigned pity, but did not stop her. She saw him at the far exit of the tent, a canvas flap that led to the muddy outdoors. Major Davies. He was shrugging on a rain poncho, his shoulders slumped, preparing to face the gray, wet morning. He was the one. He had given the order. He was the source of this madness. "Herr Major," she called out. The word was German, instinctive. He stopped, his hand on the flap, and turned. He did not look annoyed. He simply looked. Finished. She walked the last few meters, her boots squelching on the wooden floorboards. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the deep lines carved around his eyes and the gray stubble on his jaw. He was just a man, a very, very tired man. She tried to form the words in English. Her vocabulary, learned in school a lifetime ago, felt thick and useless on her tongue. "Major," she began, her voice a dry croak. She pointed back toward the ward, toward cot 14. "The medicine, the penicillin." "What about it, nurse?" he asked. His voice was rough. This medicine." She struggled, her frustration rising. "In Deutschland. It is. For generals. Only." Davies just looked at her. The exhaustion in his eyes deepened, shifting into a profound weariness, as if she had just handed him one more burden he could not carry. Helga's resolve broke. The question tore out of her, raw and unfiltered. "This. For a prisoner?" The question hung in the cold, damp air between them. For a moment, Helga saw her own words reflected in his face. She saw the absolute, gaping absurdity of her question in this place. Here, in this tent, where he had spent 12 hours fighting a losing war against death, she was asking him to validate a hierarchy of suffering. He did not get angry. He did not lecture her. He simply passed a hand over his face, scrubbing at his eyes. "He's a patient, nurse," Davies said. His voice was scraped raw. "He's a patient with a severe staph infection. I am a doctor. That's the entire equation." He looked at her, and for the first time, she felt he was truly seeing her. "There is no prisoner on my chart," he added, his voice quieter. "There's just the wound." He turned and pushed through the canvas flap, leaving Helga alone in the sudden, echoing silence of the ward. Helga stood by the tent flap for a long time, watching the gray, rain-soaked canvas. "There's just the wound." The surgeon's words echoed, stripping away a decade of ideology in a single, simple sentence. She finally turned, the ward seeming both familiar and alien. Major Stark was watching her. Helga nodded once, a gesture of concession, and walked toward the mess tent. She was no longer disobeying. The mess tent was just another canvas shell, but the air inside was thick with warmth and an aroma that made her stop in her tracks. Coffee. Real coffee. A heavy-set corporal was pouring the steaming black liquid from a large metal urn into thick ceramic mugs. He saw her, hesitated, then motioned her forward. "Go on, Fräulein," he grunted, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Looks like you need it." He handed her a mug. It was heavy, and the heat burned her cold hands. She took a sip. It was bitter, strong, and overwhelmingly real. This was a luxury she had not tasted in 3 years. Back home, there was only ersatz acorn coffee, roasted barley, a bitter memory of what used to be. Here, they were handing it out by the gallon to exhausted staff. And now, to her, their prisoner. This, she thought, was a different kind of power than the penicillin. The glass vial was a weapon of medicine, a symbol of industrial might. This coffee. This was a weapon of culture. It was the casual, unthinking comfort of a nation that had so much, it could afford to be comfortable even in the middle of a war. She drank the entire mug standing by the entrance, the heat spreading through her chest, clearing the fog from her brain. The propaganda had said the Americans were decadent. It had not said their decadence was a bottomless well of simple, human comforts. She returned the mug and walked back to the post-op ward. The morning light had grown, filtering through the canvas in a dull, gray glow. The shift was changing. The night staff, their faces pale and drawn, were handing over charts to the day staff. Helga looked at them. She looked at Major Stark, already barking orders for the morning. She looked at the orderlies changing linens. They were not monsters. They were not ideological zealots. They were simply tired. They were professionals, doing a difficult, dirty job, and they were doing it with a brutal, impersonal efficiency. A profound, sickening wave of guilt washed over her. She had hated them. She had truly believed they were butchers. How many of my own people, she wondered, died because we believed in that lie? How much easier is it to fight a monster than a man who just wants a cup of coffee? She saw a new nurse, a young private first class with freckles and hands that were shaking, struggling with an IV line for an American soldier. The soldier's veins had collapsed from dehydration. I can't get it, the young nurse whispered, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. Before she had processed the decision, Helga was moving. She stepped up to the cot. "Allow me," she said, her voice quiet. The PFC looked up, startled, ready to be defensive. Helga pointed at the soldier's arm. "You must anchor the vein. Here." She took the needle from the girl's trembling fingers, her own hand rock steady. She tapped the forearm, found the faint blue line, anchored it with her thumb, and slid the needle in with one clean, practiced motion. Dark blood flashed in the hub. She secured it. "There," Helga said. The young nurse stared, her mouth open. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you, ma'am." Helga just nodded. She turned away and walked toward cot 14. She stopped at Hans's bedside. He was still unconscious, but his breathing was different. It was deeper, slower. The mottled, angry red of his face had faded. She placed her hand on his forehead. The skin was still warm, but the fire was gone. The fever had broken. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, cold rhythm. December arrived, encasing the world in iron-hard, frozen mud. The rain turned to sleet, and then, finally, to a thick, silencing snow. Helga was no longer a prisoner. She was a fixture. She had her own routine. Wake in the cold, drink the bitter American coffee, and report to the post-op ward, which was now insulated with straw bales against the biting cold. The American nurses, even Major Stark, now treated her with a brusque, professional respect. They called her Helga, not nurse, or the German. Hans, the corporal whose life had been saved by the glass vial, was walking, albeit with a heavy limp. He was transferred to a formal POW camp, but not before he looked at Helga, his eyes clear and sane, and said, "Danke." Thank you. Helga's world had shrunk to the canvas walls of the 801st. Her transformation was complete. She was a nurse. That was the entirety of the equation, just as Davies had said. Then, just before Christmas, the equation changed. The war, which had been a distant rumble moving steadily east, suddenly roared back to life. It began with rumors, whispered by frantic ambulance drivers. It escalated with the noise, the sound of artillery, louder now, and coming from the west. "The Krauts," a wounded MP whispered, his eyes wide with shock. "They broke through. They're coming back." The Ardennes, the Bulge. The atmosphere in the hospital changed overnight. The casual confidence of the Americans vanished, replaced by a tense, angry fear. The hospital, once comfortably in the rear, was now dangerously close to a collapsing front. And with the fear, the old hatreds returned. "Get that Kraut bitch away from me." An American GI, newly wounded near Malmedy, snarled as Helga approached his cot. "She's one of them. How do we know she ain't poisoning us?" Major Stark physically shoved him back onto his pillow. "Shut your mouth, soldier. This nurse has saved more GIs this month than you've seen hot dinners. She stays." But the spell was broken. Helga was, once again, the enemy. She felt the eyes of the guards on her. The suspicion. The triage tent flooded again, but this time, the wounds were different. Frostbite. Men frozen solid in their foxholes. The exhaustion was absolute. On December 23rd, Major Davies called a meeting. The tent was frigid. "All right," he said, his voice cutting through the cold. "The 801st is bugging out. We're falling back to Verdun." A collective sigh of relief. "Except," he continued, "the 101st is completely surrounded in Bastogne. They have almost no surgical capability left. I'm taking a volunteer ghost team forward. A surgical truck, 2 jeeps, and whatever supplies we can carry." The nurses and medics looked at each other. Forward. "Into that. I need my best," Davies said. Major Stark, Sergeant Willis, our best anesthesiologist. He looked around the tent, his eyes scanning, calculating. His gaze landed on Helga. She tensed. Nurse Helga, he said, his voice flat, as if stating a simple fact. You know my triage. You can close a wound faster than anyone here. You're coming. Helga's mind went blank. He was choosing her. A German prisoner. To take forward? A small, terrified part of her wanted to scream, to refuse. But a larger part, the part that had been reforged by the coffee and the calm orders and the methodical professionalism, merely nodded. She had a fleeting thought. She could escape. In the chaos, she could slip away and find the German lines. The thought evaporated as soon as it came. She wasn't thinking about escape. She was thinking about how they would keep the plasma from freezing. Pack the essentials, Stark ordered, already moving. Plasma, sulfa, dressings, and the gold. 10 minutes later, Helga was handed a metal-lined medical box. It was heavy and insulated. You drop this, Major Stark said, her voice fierce. You're walking to Bastogne. Got it? Helga nodded. She knew what was inside. She could almost hear the soft, precious rattle of the glass vials of penicillin. They were driving into the heart of the blizzard, toward a surrounded town, carrying a box of miracles. The 5th of January, 1945. Bastogne Clearing Station. They had been in hell for 2 weeks. The ghost team had made it into Bastogne just before the last road was cut. They had set up in the cellar of a bombed-out seminary, which was soon overrun. They had operated for 72 hours straight, fueled by adrenaline and the last of the mess tent's coffee. Now, the siege had lifted, but the cost was staggering. The 801st had re-established a formal clearing station in a larger, reinforced tent just outside the town limits, and the team had been absorbed back into its familiar, chaotic embrace. But Helga was not the same. Bastogne had burned away the last remnants of the woman she had been. The cold did not bother her. The exhaustion was a constant, like the hum of the generator outside. The air inside the advanced triage tent snapped with the competing smells of wet canvas, sharp antiseptic, and the ever-present, sweet rot of gangrene. Outside, the artillery rumbled, a dull percussion against the thin fabric walls. Helga moved with an economy of motion that mirrored Davies's own. She was his shadow, his most trusted scrub nurse. Pressure dressing, Helga. Now. Clamps. Suture. She was there before he even finished the words. In a brief lull, she patrolled the pre-op cots. She stopped at the bedside of a young American soldier, a replacement who looked no older than 17. He was shivering violently under the coarse wool blankets, his eyes wide and unfocused with fever. She recognized the creeping, telltale flush of sepsis. Her hand, instinctively, went to check the thready pulse at his neck. She drew the blanket higher onto his chest. He was just a boy, terrified and cold. Kalt. Es ist so kalt. He was murmuring the same words Hans had murmured. You are safe now, Junge, she whispered in German, the words coming naturally. It was the language of comfort, of her childhood. Above the operating theater entrance, a crude, hand-painted sign had been hung. The same one from the 801st, transported and nailed up like a religious icon. Triage priority. Severity only. Rank. Nationality second. It was a ritual now, reading it. But it was no longer a shock. It was simply the rule. Major Davies looked up from the next cot, his face a gray mask of exhaustion, identical to the one he had worn 8 weeks ago. Some things, Helga realized, never changed. Nurse, he called, his voice rough. He jested at the shivering GI. His chart. Fever's 105. He's septic. Yes, Major, Helga said. I see it. Check the penicillin stock, Davies ordered, his voice flat. We need it for that GI. Helga paused. Her hand instinctively went to the small, cold glass vial in her own pocket. She had been tasked with carrying the day's immediate use doses to protect them from the cold. She looked at the vial. It was amber. It was small. It was full of the golden liquid. 8 weeks ago, This moment had shattered her world. The sight of this object, this Wunderwaffe, had represented an impossible act of madness. Now, she looked at the vial, and it was just medicine. It was not a symbol of American arrogance or endless wealth. It was not a tool of soft power. It was not a miracle. It was 50,000 units of Penicillium notatum, a precise chemical compound to be deployed against a specific bacterial enemy. The wound. That was all there was. She pulled the vial from her pocket, along with a sterile syringe. "I have it, doctor," Helga said. "Right here." She turned back to the young American, her movements sure and practiced, and began to save his life.